Howdy, Dennis Bradford here. Let's think some about being, feeling, and doing better. Bhagavan Sri Ramana Maharshi was one of the greatest 20th century sages. I'm unqualified to introduce you to his teachings. However, my purpose here is simply to direct your attention to them in case you want to learn more. He was also called the Maha Rishi, that is, the Maha Rishi, great sage. His Hindu devotees usually called him Bhagavan, which is what I do here. He was born in South India in 1879, Christian era, became a liberated or enlightened being 17 years later, and died in 1950. His general outlook was Advaita Vendanta. Advaita is an ultimate doctrine of non-duality. His teaching never changed. Being is one. It is the self, with a capital S, manifested in the universe and in all forms. To realize that, we simply have to quiet the mind, in other words, detach from thoughts, so that the true answer to who am I can arise. It is cognition that, quote, is the rise of egoity, that is the cause and source of the rise of all other thoughts. Therefore, if the self-conceit of the form of egoity is destroyed, all other thoughts will perish completely, end quote. All the quotations here are from the collected works of Ramana Maharshi. There is no inner-outer distinction. The distinction between inner and outer is only with reference to the body. In truth, there is neither inner nor outer, end quote. The way to living well is to keep focused on the self and stop conceptualizing while we go about ordinary tasks. Quote, when one is engaged in various empirical acts, there should be the firm conviction, I am the self, without allowing the false idea, I am the body, and so on, to arise. The idea is to identify with everything. We noted in the previous video how Hakuin encourages us constantly to ask, who am I, non-conceptually. Bhagavan offers the same encouragement. The inquiry, who am I, is the principal means to the removal of all misery and the attainment of the supreme bliss, end quote. Again, quote, to gain that happiness which is one's nature, the path of knowledge, the inquiry of the form, who am I, is the principal means, end quote. It's important to note that removing all dissatisfaction and living well are the same thing. There's one task described in two ways. The key is, quote, the renunciation of the I thought, end quote. Stop thinking and saying all words like I, me, and mine. If your mind is not peaceful, quote, the reason is the absence of strength or one-pointedness of mind, end quote. Do not think of the self, which is, quote, the reality which is self-manifest, end quote. Quote, one should not think of it as this or as that. The very thought of thinking will end in bondage, end quote. Instead of trying to think of the self, the idea is simply to experience it. How? Quote, the experience of self is possible only for the mind that has become subtle and unmoving as a result of prolonged meditation, end quote. Once again, then, we have a sage encouraging us to meditate in order to still the mind by letting obstructive thoughts settle down. It's that simple. There's nothing else to do. Stilling the mind results in directly experiencing the self, in other words, spiritual awakening. He's using the self to denote what I call in these videos being. It's actually more than just being. It's also consciousness and bliss. Quote, the nature of awareness is existence, consciousness, bliss. When the world, which is what is seen, has been removed, there will be realization of the self, which is the seer, end quote. Spiritual enlightenment Realization, waking up, is the uncovering of our true nature. That nature is existence, consciousness, bliss. When the mind becomes quiescent, the world will disappear, end quote. What is the mind? It's nothing but thoughts. Quote, apart from thoughts, there is no such thing as mind. Therefore, thought is the nature of mind. Apart from thoughts, there is no independent entity called the world, end quote. To inquire into the nature of mind is to ask, who am I non-conceptually? When one persistently inquires into the nature of mind, the mind will end, leaving the self as the residue. The thought, who am I, will destroy all other thoughts. Then there will arise self-realization, end quote. How should we meditate? What should we do when other thoughts arise? When other thoughts arise, one should not pursue them, but should inquire, to whom do they arise? The answer that would emerge would be, to me. Thereupon, the mind will go back to its source, and the thought that arose will become quiescent. With repeated practice in this manner, the mind will develop the skill to stay in its source, end quote. Note that meditating properly is a skill that anyone can learn. There's no essential difference between sages and the rest of us. The purpose of meditation is to focus the mind and make it, quote, one-pointed. One should persistently hold on to the meditation on the self. The mind should not be allowed to wander towards worldly objects and what concerns other people. Both desire and hatred should be eschewed, end quote. Again, the mind is just a set of thoughts. The thought I is the first thought of the mind, and that is egoity, end quote. Egoity is the problem to be dissolved. To exist, the ego requires separation from everything else. Proper meditation undermines that separation, and so it undermines all dissatisfaction. How long should we continue to meditate? Quote, as long as there are impressions of objects in the mind, so long the inquiry, who am I, is required. Until the mind effortlessly is its natural state of freedom from concepts, that is, till the sense of I and mine exists no longer, end quote. How should we understand non-attachment? Quote, as thoughts arise, destroying them utterly without any residue in the very place of their origin is non-attachment, end quote. Use non-attachment to, quote, dive within oneself, end quote, in order to realize self. Wisdom means the appearance of no object. In other words, not seeking what is other than the self is detachment or desirelessness. Not leaving the self is wisdom, end quote. The purpose of all meditative or yogic practices is to concentrate the mind. This requires mental work, but its goal does not. Quote, dhyana is achieved through deliberate mental effort. In samadhi, there is no such effort, end quote. The only way to liberation is enlightened self. There is no such thing as the I. Happiness lies in peaceful repose enjoyed when resting in the self, end quote. Living in the peaceful state of egolessness is living well or wisely. Let's end emotional distress.